All right, welcome to another episode of my podcast. Today we have a special guest, Peter Singer. I'm happy that you came.
Pleasure to be with you, Walter.
Yeah, so let's dive right in. Peter Singer is perhaps the most famous living philosopher. He is widely known for his involvement in the animal liberation movement, with effective altruism. So he's very well known, and yeah, it's a pleasure to have him here. And recently he retired at Princeton. He's now an emeritus professor and has himself started a podcast. What was the motivation there?
Well, the motivation was that I'm not going to be teaching, but I would still like to be reaching audiences of people with my ideas. I've always done that by writing, but obviously there are a lot of people listening to podcasts now. Perhaps, regrettably, there are fewer people reading books. So it's another way to get some messages out and some discussion going about some of the things that most concern me.
Hmm. Yeah, I suppose when you started out studying philosophy, podcasts were not really a thing at all. And it was only in the last, say, 10, 20 years that podcasts have become more popular.
That's true. Yes, there was the word itself did not exist when I started out in philosophy, and obviously there wasn't even the internet, so it wasn't possible.
Hmm. Yeah, did you ever hear philosophers on the radio, perhaps?
Yes, there were some philosophy discussion. Excuse me. There were some philosophy discussions on the radio. I think the BBC had some programs.
Hmm.
And there's still a program on Australian radio called the Moral Maze, which
Hmm.
I don't know that it was going actually that long ago, but there was somewhat similar kinds of discussion programs that appeared from time to time and then disappeared.
Yeah, what's your impression there? Has philosophy become perhaps less visible in the public, in, say, TV, media more generally, or yeah, or less so?
Oh, I think philosophy is much more visible now than it
Hmm.
was when I started. Of course, again, it depends on the culture. Um, in England, there were some professors who appeared on the telly, as they called it, on TV. A.J. Ayer was well known as a kind of telly don, but that was considered unusual. And to some extent, there was a kind of a rather snobbish or elitist view that, if you're a really serious philosopher, you wouldn't appear on television because that was too
Hmm.
lowbrow.
So when did you decide to study philosophy? When did that decision happen in your life?
That decision happened in stages. The first decision I made was when I went to university. Originally, I applied to do a law degree. In
Hmm.
Australia, you can do a law degree straight out of high school. And I saw a counsellor who looked at my results in my final year of high school and said, well, you've done very well in a number of humanities subjects, English literature, history, language, and you might find law a little bit dry. Why don't you combine it with an arts degree?
Hmm.
Takes a bit longer, but you might find it more interesting. So I thought, well, yeah, why not? I'm not in a hurry. Be good to do a bit more. And then the question was, what will I do in my arts degree? And I knew I wanted to do some history because I'd really enjoyed history at high school. But my sister had, I had then a sister who was 6 years older than me.
Hmm.
Sadly, she's no longer with us.
Hmm.
And she had a boyfriend who subsequently became her husband, who had done some philosophy. And I talked to him a bit about it, and it sounded interesting. So I thought, yeah, okay, I'll combine history and philosophy. I'll do both of them. So that was the start of the whole thing. And then when I finished the arts degree the way the course ran. You finish the arts degree a little bit before you finish the law degree. And when I finished the arts degree, I was offered a scholarship by the University of Melbourne, this is where I was studying, to do a master's degree. And I went over to the law school and said, the arts faculty's offered me this scholarship. Sounds interesting. Can I postpone finishing the law degree? And they said, sure, no problem, just come back whenever you like. So I did the master's degree, and then I got another scholarship offer to go to Oxford, and that was even more exciting, of course. So I, postponed the law degree further, and in fact, then I never came back to it. So I'm not a lawyer, but I got into philosophy that way.
So what was your PhD on?
I actually don't have a PhD. I must admit, this is a
Oh.
little scandalous today. I know. I have the graduate degree I did at Oxford was called a Bachelor of Philosophy, which is odd because it's not a bachelor's degree. It is a graduate degree, but it's a 2-year degree, and it involves both coursework and a shorter thesis. Whereas the UK and Australian PhDs were only by thesis. And Australian universities at that time were quite happy to offer jobs to people who had a B.Phil because they actually thought it was a better teaching qualification because it was broader than just doing the thesis only PhD. So that's what I did. And when I completed it, I got offered a 2-year college teaching position at University College, Oxford. And then I went to New York University where I was offered a visiting position for 1 year. And then I got a long-term position back in Australia at La Trobe University when I had a tenured senior lectureship. So that was how I worked my way into my career.
Yeah, it's interesting that if you look at Australian universities, there has been quite a bit of import from Oxford, but also from Australia to Oxford. The direction has gone two ways, I would say.
It has, yes. And it's interesting. Australia has certainly had some influential and significant philosophers who've contributed to thinking. So at the time that I was an undergraduate, it was people like David Armstrong, Jack Smart, their views were well known overseas, particularly in philosophy of mind. And for Jack Smart, gradually his utilitarianism became well known as well. And of course, he wrote half of the Smart and Williams Utilitarianism For and Against volume.
Yeah, I had Matty Wilkes recently on the podcast too. Please considers herself quite adjacent to effective altruism and utilitarianism, and we were wondering whether there's something special about Australia that causes there to come so many utilitarians out of there. My wife is Ella Browning, and she also is born, raised in Australia, and herself a utilitarian, effective altruist, and it seems maybe that it's the climate. I'm not sure. Do you have
Maybe
any
we've
hypothesis?
dropped the utilitarian chemical into the water supply of the major cities. That's how we do it. We trying to take over the world.
Yeah, perhaps. So when did you
Yeah.
become interested in utilitarianism? Did that happen early in your
Yeah, that
philosophical?
happened quite early. I think in my second year as an undergraduate, I took a course with a philosopher called H.J. McCloskey, he was teaching the basic ethics course then, and he was certainly not a utilitarian. He was an intuitionist in the style of W.D. Ross. So he thought that there were some self-evident prima facie duties. Didn't have quite the same list of self-evident duties as Ross did, which was a bit of a problem if they're supposed to be self-evident, but still. And I think, his major contribution, I suppose, that people still talk about, though they don't know that it came from him, at least I think it came from him, is this example of the sheriff in a southern US city where a white woman has been raped by an African American, and there is a lynch mob that have grabbed 6 blacks, and they're going to lynch them all because they don't know who did it, but they're just going to make an example of what happens. So there they are all ready to lynch these 6 people. You're the sheriff, but you're powerless to actually stop them. They have guns too, obviously, as people do in these parts of America. But there is one way that you could change what they're doing, and that is by saying, stop, I have evidence that this one, and you just point to one of them, is the one who's done it. And you think if you do that, they'll let the other 5 go, they'll lynch him, and they'll be satisfied. So McCloskey's point was that for a utilitarian, that's what the sheriff ought to do, or to frame this one person so that only one of them are going to die rather than 6 of them. And McCloskey thought that was just obviously wrong. A sheriff's duty must be to uphold the law no matter what, and even if that means that 5 or that 6 innocent people die rather than 1 innocent person, that's what the sheriff ought to do. So we got that example as a kind of counter-utilitarian example. And I thought, well, if really there's nothing else the sheriff could do, maybe that is the right thing to do. And in thinking about that, and I think I wrote an essay on it, which McCloskey, to his credit, gave me a good grade for. Uh, I thought, well, maybe I am a utilitarian. Maybe anyway, it came upon me gradually, I suppose, but that was the start of it, I would say.
Yeah, it was interesting to me. I mean, typically in any first year or second year ethics course you might have in a philosophy degree, even in Germany, utilitarianism is going to be discussed as one of the big theories of consequentialism. But at least for me, my professor couldn't hide his dislike of utilitarianism. He was more interested in a kind of Aquinas-style virtue ethics approach, and he was very strongly opposed to it. But perhaps in virtue of that, you become more interested in that position. Why that opposite? Why are they so strongly opposed to that view? Why is it so implausible? And certainly,
yeah, I think that's right. I think that's what happened to me, really, that I thought, oh, if this
yeah.
is supposed to be a knockdown objection, maybe the theory is actually stronger than most people think.
It seems that often utilitarianism is very quickly discarded by some easily thought experiments, perhaps, but it's unclear whether utilitarianists themselves would necessarily endorse that same view. I mean, you had that big debacle with FTX and the whole crypto scam going on. It's not at all clear that engaging in that is something utilitarianism would recommend, right?
Right. No, I think utilitarians certainly would not recommend what Sam Bankman-Fried did. And obviously it did in fact, end up disastrously. And it's a kind of hubris, I think, to think that, well, I'm smarter than everybody else, so I don't have to follow the rules and respect my clients' trust funds. I can make use of them because I'm going to be smart enough to make a lot of money with their trust funds, and then I can pay them all back. But clearly there is a risk there, and utilitarians generally will say, you really should follow these general rules about being honest and truthful, and not making false representations, cheating or stealing. Yes, there will be some circumstances in which you might do something different, and certainly in this case of the sheriff, it's a very extreme example. Most of us will never be in a case like that, but maybe then lying is justified. But certainly, not in Sam Bankman-Fried's situation.
Yeah, one counter objection to the effective altruist movement that is you can see often, say, on social media or maybe recent papers that have been written is that it fails to recognize perhaps systemic problems that need to be tackled instead. So say you might think, well, capitalism perhaps is inherently bad, and then trying to alleviate problems doesn't solve the underlying problem, capitalism. What would you say to that?
Well, yes, an effective altruist, I think, would say to that, well, so how do we change the structural problem? Right? Let's agree that there is a structural problem, but if you want me to work on that big problem rather than try to help people in extreme poverty, which we know we can do, we know we can support organizations that are going to be very effective and make good use of your donation to help specific people, but not to change capitalism. But what is your recommendation for what I should do in order to change capitalism? And if somebody comes up with a plausible path whereby I might contribute to that, and if they also come up with a plausible alternative to capitalism that we could be confident would work better than capitalism and would produce a better system, then an effective altruist ought to consider that option. It's not ruled out at all. It's not ruled out by effective altruism. But I must admit that nobody has really come up with with that kind of route by, yes, if you do this, you will increase the chances of overthrowing capitalism. I haven't, if there is such a route to overthrowing it, I haven't heard about it.
So you yourself also were quite interested in Marxism. I think you've written a book, a very short introduction to Marx. How did that come about?
So yes, I was invited. So that book is in a series which is now called Very Short Introductions. Originally, it was called Past Masters, and it was only on people, not on topics as it is now. And I had published. You asked a while ago what my PhD thesis was, and I told you that I didn't do a PhD, but I did. In fact, the B.Phil has a shorter thesis. And I wrote on democracy and disobedience. Is there an obligation to obey the law in a democracy? And this was during the Vietnam War and also the protests in the south of the US about, Martin Luther King's civil disobedience campaigns. So I wrote that, and one of the examiners recommended it to the board of Oxford University Press, and they published it. It was my first book. That, I guess, gave me some contact with Oxford University Press, and somebody there a few years later asked me if I would write a book on John Stuart Mill for the Oxford Past Masters series. And I, probably they thought, well, I'm a utilitarian and so on, so I would want to write on Mill. But by this time, I was at Monash University, where in the same department as Chin Lu Ten, who was then also a lecturer in that department. And he had written on Mill himself. He just knew so much more about Mill than I did that I would have felt awkward writing a book on Mill so I said, look, I really, I'm not a Mill expert. You should ask Ten. They didn't. I think they asked somebody else. But then they said, well, is there someone else you would like to write on? And I did say, yes, I could write something on Marx. And that was because during that B.Phil course, I had selected Marx and Hegel as a special area of study. At that time, the B.Phil included an exam paper on a particular authority figure. Like, most people did straightforward philosophers, Hume, Kant, Locke, whoever it might be. But I was interested in Marx at the time, and as I say, I had studied him. I had some views that I thought were perhaps not widely out there in the literature, and that I could write a short book. These series books are 30,000 words. So, if somebody had asked me to write a major scholarly work on Marx, I would have said, no, I'm not willing to do that. I don't see myself as a scholar in that time, of that sort, and it would take an enormous amount of time. But the 30,000 word book I could do, and I was able to write that. And actually, that was quite successful. And then I wrote, on that basis, I was asked to write the book on Hegel in the same series, which I think I was only asked to do that because the people who were authorities on Hegel basically said, Hegel in 30,000 words? You must be kidding.
Yeah.
But I had written a little bit on Hegel in the Marx book, because you can't understand Marx without knowing something about Hegel. Marx had all his roots in Hegel, and he himself said that he had stood Hegel on his head. So yeah, there was something on Hegel there. And so I felt I could do 30,000 words on Hegel. And that's how that one came about too.
Do you see any parallels between Marx and utilitarianism?
Well, it's possible to interpret Marxist ethics as working for the greatest happiness of everybody. So you could say that, well, underlying Marx's ethic was a kind of utilitarianism. I think most Marxists would reject that. And certainly Marx himself was scornful about Jeremy Bentham, the founder of English utilitarians. I can't remember exactly the quote, but it's something like this insipid, leather-tongued pedant or something of that sort. Also some remark about being the philosopher of the English shopkeeper. So I suppose shopkeepers have to calculate or something of that sort. I don't know. So Marxists generally did not think of themselves as utilitarians. And, I think the parallels are actually, a bit stretched because clearly, as I say, Marx had his philosophical roots in Hegel and particularly in the phenomenology of spirit, where the whole idea is that spirit, namely consciousness in humans, moves towards freedom, moves towards liberation, and to self-realization, which is the path to freedom. And so Marx, I think, took that over, but changed it instead of being spirit and consciousness to being the material world. But still, there was a move towards freedom, a move towards liberation, as comes when the proletariat take over and the state withers away, and we all contribute according to our abilities and take according to our needs. So I think, yeah, it's a little bit of a sort of force. You have to really squeeze Marx to get into a utilitarian framework. It's not really true to what
But
he
at least
would
if you
have
think
thought.
about both as consequentialist approaches to ethics, political actions, then it seems the parallel might be quite strong. So the ends justify the means.
Yes, you could say that. Yes, that may be more later communists, like Lenin, perhaps. But yeah, I mean, Marx might have accepted that. So yeah, that's a very general view. I think that's not. It's something that utilitarians might accept. Yes, sometimes if the ends are clear and important enough, they will justify doing things that are harmful or would otherwise be wrong if they were not the only way to achieve some end, as in the case of the sheriff again. So yeah, you could say that there was some parallel there. That's true.
Yeah, it seems to me that at least in the recent criticisms of effective altruism, a lot of them seem to come from a kind of Marxist point of view. It's sort of interesting from that
Yeah.
perspective.
I mean, certainly that point about that you have to overthrow capitalism. Yeah, but the problem is that capitalism has proven much more difficult to overthrow than Marx imagined, because Marx thought that there was going to be this crisis, and that this was his scientific understanding of the laws of history, his theory of history, that capitalism was digging its own grave and was bound to be overthrown. In fact, he kept thinking that various economic crises in his own lifetime would produce the overthrow of capitalism. But of course, not only did it not happen in Marx's lifetime, it still hasn't happened, and capitalism looks stronger and more resilient than it ever did before, really.
Yeah, one of the arguments by my students who identifies themselves as a Marxist was quite puzzling to me when they argued it would be bad to give money to the homeless because it would promote capitalism. But what about the suffering of the homeless person? Should we sacrifice the homeless to overthrow capitalism? It seems strange.
Well, you would have to be very certain that somehow not helping the homeless was going to contribute to the overthrow of capitalism, and I just can't see that at all. I can't see that seems really hard-hearted. It's interesting that a somewhat parallel argument is used by people in the animal movement too. So there are some people who oppose reforms, like there was a referendum, citizens-initiated referendum in California to significantly expand the sizes of cages that egg-laying hens were confined in, and that pigs were, and to give veal calves room to turn around, which they didn't even have in their stalls at that time. And not many, but there were one or two extremists in the animal movement who said, no, this will make factory farming harder to get rid of altogether, or the exploitation of animals harder to get rid of because it will soften it. But then you're really sacrificing the interests of many generations of animals because of this hope that somehow you will be able to overthrow it. And of course, that hasn't happened. This first of these referendums was in 2008, I think. So, we are many, many years past that. And there have not been changes in the laws everywhere. And in fact, in the United States, federally, the law has still not changed, and not in the states where most animals are raised. So you would have had more animal suffering, and as far as I can see, made no difference to progress in overthrowing factory farming altogether.
Yeah, I suppose you get that quite frequently with any social movement that wants to um, overthrow the exploitation of a particular group, say with slavery in the US. I'm sure there were lots of people who were going for perhaps marginal improvements because they thought perhaps improving the livelihoods, the well-being of slaves a bit would be better than not doing anything. But then to those who think slavery must immediately be abolished, then this might perhaps prolong the existence of slavery. So you get this trade-off, perhaps, where marginal improvements could potentially extend the suffering and exploitation of a group.
Certainly, you do get that kind of argument, yes. Again, I don't see any evidence that it made any difference to when slavery was overthrown in that particular case.
Yeah, I think if you look at history with most of these movements, the gradual improvement has always helped. Typically didn't hold back further gains because, at least psychologically, I think it changes what people perceive as the status quo and what are acceptable levels of well-being. So for animals, if animal welfare legislation improves, typically humans then start to see that as the new baseline of what perhaps is acceptable, and going below that in the future perhaps would be much harder to justify. So even tiny improvements are perhaps to be preferred.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it makes people more aware of animal welfare issues, and the California referendum that I mentioned certainly made most people in California, because there was a lot of news media about it, learn for the first time that many farmed animals were not able to stretch their limbs in their enclosures or not able to turn around. And that was quite shocking.
So when you started writing in philosophy, perhaps around the time you got your first job, was there any interest among philosophers in animal ethics?
So there was a tiny minority interest, I would say. So when I got as I say, my first job was at University College, Oxford, when I finished my BPhil, that was midway through 1971. And there were a really small number of people in Oxford, actually, and that's how I got interested in this. I met a Canadian graduate student called Richard Keshen, who was a vegetarian. And in 1970, when I met Richard, I don't think I'd ever really met a vegetarian or a non-Indian vegetarian, let's say, a vegetarian who simply said, I'm a vegetarian because I don't think it's right to treat animals the way they're being treated. And so that was a bit of a revelation to me. But there were a couple of others. He introduced me to some of his friends. There were Canadians, Stan and Rosalind Godlovich, and together with a philosopher called John Harris, who it's a little confusing, but there were two John Harrises in philosophy at Oxford at that time. So the one who became a well-known professor of bioethics at Manchester is not the John Harris I'm talking about. It was a different one. But they co-edited a book called Animals, Men and Morals, which I really think is the first book of the modern animal movement. It was a book of essays. It was an anthology, and it had a variety of different approaches, but it was pretty radical stuff for the time. And several of them, not all of them, were philosophers. There was an essay by Patrick Corbett, who was a philosopher, I think, at Sussex, if I remember rightly. So he had obviously had these views, but I think had not previously published them before this anthology. And then, let's say, some of the others were graduate students. But there wasn't very much going on, really. And then I reviewed that book for the New York Review of Books. It had been published in England and got no reviews whatsoever, and we were all very disappointed. But then, when my friends, as they then were, the Godloviches and John Harris, told me that the book was going to be published in the US, I thought, well, I want to make sure that it does get noticed there. And the place to do that, I thought, was the New York Review of Books, which was the sort of radical progressive publication at the time. Everybody who was somewhat on the left was reading it. Well, anybody with some intellectual interests on the left. So I wrote to the editor, Bob Silvers, and told him what I wanted to say, that this book, although it was by different authors and didn't put a single view, was in fact a kind of manifesto for an animal liberation movement. And somewhat to my surprise, he expressed interest in this idea. And I say surprising because, animals were just seen as not an issue, basically, and I think that's why the book didn't get noticed in England. It was not an important issue like the Vietnam War or racial discrimination or any of those things. It was an issue for a certain set of people, mostly women of an upper class background, to be concerned about cats and dogs and horses, maybe, but it just wasn't an issue on anyone else's radar. But Bob Silvers, I think, sort of saw what I was getting at and thought it was interesting. And he didn't commit to publishing it. He said, well, I need to see what you write, but sure, send it over and I'll take a look. So that came out in 1973. And I did pretty soon afterwards get a letter from Tom Regan, who was then was developing ideas about animal rights. Tom had been interested in Gandhi and Gandhi's non-violence, civil disobedience. And of course, Gandhi was a vegetarian, and so Tom had got interested in vegetarianism from an animal rights perspective, and he developed an animal rights ethic, which was a little bit different from my utilitarian approach. But he said he'd like to meet me, and he was going to be in England. I was still in Oxford at this time, and we did actually meet in the summer of '73. And he was pretty much the first other philosopher with an interest. The other one was James Rachels, who, when he'd published, I think the first anthology in essentially what we now call practical or applied ethics, a book called Moral Problems. And after the New York Review article was published, he wrote to me and said, I've always wondered what it is that justifies the way we treat animals. After I read your review, I now think there isn't anything that justifies it. And that was, he was actually, so he contacted me before Tom did. So he was really the first philosopher, established philosopher who had sort of said that to me. As I say, Patrick Corbett had written an essay in the book, and he's certainly had those views. But I thought that was really encouraging, and it was one of the things that made me think maybe I should write a book on this topic.
So how many editions are there? 5 of Animal Liberation?
Well, that depends what you count as a new edition. And if you're a publisher, you have a vested interest in saying that something is a new edition, even if the basic text is the same, but it has a new preface, or maybe it has some little addendum at the end. So by my count, there's only 3 editions, really. There is the 1975 edition, the 1990 edition, and now Animal Liberation Now, which, if you like, is the 3rd edition, although this time the publishers wanted to market it as a new book because they thought they would do better that way. So that's why it's got the now to change the title. But yes, they did say there were other editions because they had a new preface and so on. But
So what did
in terms of changing the basic text, there's really only 3.
What are the biggest improvements you would say in animal welfare? And then what are the biggest disappointments for you over those years?
Well, the biggest improvements are actually in the European Union, but I should say, and the UK as well, because
Mm,
the UK had EU laws, and fortunately, it has not really gone backwards in that respect since leaving the EU. Um, but the EU brought in a whole series of laws. I think they mostly were passed in the 1990s, but they had a 10-year phase-in period. So they only came
mm,
into effect early in this century. But they were a bit like the California initiative that I mentioned. They predated that initiative in terms of requiring that animals have enough space to, case of hens, to stretch their wings, to walk around. Hens also had to have a nesting box to lay eggs in because it's stressful to hens to lay eggs in a sort of open public space. I guess
mm,
they have an innate instinct to protect their eggs. And veal calves had to be able to turn around, and breeding sows, the mother pigs, which also were kept in narrow stalls that they couldn't even turn around in. So those are important changes, and they have improved the lives of hundreds of millions of animals, hundreds of millions of animals each year, actually, of
mm,
successive generations. Uh, so I would say that's the biggest change. The other candidate for an important change is the greater awareness of being vegetarian or vegan, and the greater availability of vegetarian and vegan foods in supermarkets, in restaurants. That's a really important change too. And that's worldwide pretty well. Anyway, that's in the more affluent parts of the world.
mm,
The biggest disappointment, well, again, I could say there are two. Firstly, um, factory farming itself is still continuing. It's still the case that the majority of the animal products people eat come from animals who are not able to walk around outside in
mm,
the sunshine, not able to live in a social group that's natural to them, um, and essentially, I think, have miserable lives. And that's particularly, if we're talking about land animals, that's particularly true of chickens, um, who are the most numerous of the land animals we eat, of course, and are still confined, not in cages, but in very crowded conditions in very large sheds, maybe 20,000 birds
mm,
to a single shed. Um, and then, but you also have to add, there's been a huge rise in aquaculture, which is really just factory farming underwater. And fish are vertebrates. They're clearly capable of feeling pain. There's been good research demonstrating that. Um, and now the number of fish that we raise for food, I'm not talking about wild caught fish, actually exceeds all the land animals that we
mm,
raise for food. So it's something like maybe 120 billion fish raised and killed each year, and perhaps 80 billion land animals. So that's greatly increasing the amount of animal suffering. And finally, I'll mention that it's very disappointing that some countries, of which China is the most notable, have greatly increased their meat consumption, in the case of China, because it's become more prosperous, but without bringing in any animal welfare laws. So
mm,
there are laws about the slaughter of animals in China, but there are no laws about how you can keep animals, how much you can crowd them together, how much you can confine them. So China has become a kind of nightmare for animals, with enormous factory farms and very crowded conditions and very constrained conditions.
mm. Yeah, I suppose one of the clashes you had in animal ethics literature was between what we might describe as the animal rights defenders and then the more consequentialist types, the utilitarians, where, for instance, when we think about the existence of zoos, some might say, on the animal rights perspective, no, captivity is intrinsically harmful to animals. But for utilitarian, that must not be true, right? It's conceivable that an animal living in a zoo with great condition, veterinary care, a great enclosure might be happier than, say, a counterpart in the wild.
That's certainly possible, yes. It will depend on the species of the animal, of
Hmm.
course. Some animals normally have a very wide range that you can't possibly provide for, even in a large enclosure, and
Hmm.
may still have an instinct to do that. Um, yes, but sure, it's possible. And in fact, if you are considering the fact that we have zoos and that the animals, many of the animals in the zoos have been bred in captivity, they no longer have the skills to survive in the wild.
Hmm.
And in some cases, of course, their habitat is threatened anyway. So if you ask what should we do with these animals now, um, the answer is certainly not, well, captivity is a violation of their rights, so we must somehow let them free or return them to the habitat that they came from.
Hmm.
Sometimes that's not just not possible. So some people will say, well, then we should stop them breeding so that we don't have more animals in captivity
Hmm.
for many generations. And again, but as a utilitarian, I would say, well, that will depend on what their lives are really like, and
Hmm.
depending on the species, maybe they can have good lives, and if in that case, I don't see the necessity to stop breeding. But I do think you need stricter regulations and higher standards
Hmm.
for uh, conditions in which confined animals live. And I certainly think that we should completely stop capture from the wild, because that's obviously extremely stressful and distressing to any animal.
Yeah, I just finished a short book that's soon going to be published with Heather Browning, my wife, who came from a zookeeping background and then turned into philosophy and studied animal welfare science and animal ethics and is now writing on that a lot. And we make this case that when animal ethicists have written about zoos, typically it has been very critical. Um, but also not very nuanced. So some zoo animals live much longer lives than their counterparts in the wild. They seem to have much happier lives. And we try to make a case for how we can improve the welfare of animals further, but also recognize the important roles they might have. And one very important one might be, at least that we try to make a case for, is that going to a zoo when you're a child, say, that puts you in contact with animals and gives you perhaps a kind of kinship where you see those animals as beings that matter and have interests that are not just machine-like, but play around. And because of that, we should care about them. We shouldn't just treat them as if they were just objects, but subjects in their own right.
Yeah, that's an interesting argument that zoos do have a positive educational role. I don't know, you may know, or your wife may know, uh, whether there is research showing what influence zoos have on people
Hmm.
nowadays, because it's also possible that they have the influence to say, well, look, animals are things that we can put in
Hmm.
cages and keep for our entertainment. Um,
No,
so
there has been research on it. I mean, historically, I think that case would be very strong, where we put animals in tiny cages and they were just there to entertain us. But now that has shifted quite a bit. I mean, obviously, some zoos have no spaces for animals to hide, and it still seems like they're just there for entertainment. But the very best zoos are really trying to emphasize, say, the personalities of those animals, what they care about. Um, and there it seems that it's much more about engagement. And researchers in this area have written about visitor attitudes and how they might change. So typically, it's already the case that most people who go to zoos already care more about animals. So that might be a bias, of course. So if people already care about animals, then perhaps it doesn't matter too much. But certainly the existence of zoos has demonstrated at least a weak effect that people started to think more about animal issues because there's a lot of education going on about conservation issues and welfare issues, which especially children might never have heard about when they go to a zoo for the first time.
yeah, that's good. I mean, I think you're right. There's just a huge difference in different zoos,
Hmm.
and some of them are doing a good educational job, as well as doing a good job in meeting the needs, behavioral needs,
Yeah.
as well as physical needs of the animals. And then, especially again in the United States, there are sort of roadside zoos, basically commercial
Yes.
places that are very not regulated or very lightly regulated, which are pretty horrible, both in terms of animal welfare and not doing any education either.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that the US doesn't have much regulation there. I mean, one thing you do have is the large zoo associations, where in order to be a part of them, you have to meet pretty rigorous standards in animal welfare, and those are increasing every couple of years. So it's an ongoing process. And in order to maintain your membership in those associations, you have to keep improving the welfare standards. So that should make us pretty optimistic, at least, about where zoos are going in the future.
But you don't have to be a member of the association, right? If you have some small commercial enterprise, you can just,
That's true, but then typically you
thumb your
get a
nose.
bad reputation. There have been some cases of zoos, certainly, that where there was a lot of public outcry about them, and often then they close or try to be overhauled. It's an interesting history, certainly, but yeah, we can't deny that there's a lot of zoos that have very bad welfare standards. And it would be great if there was legislation to get rid of those in order to improve welfare.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And again, I think China is a problem. When I was in China,
Mm,
my host took me to the Great Wall, somewhere, where it was relatively close to Beijing. And I was pretty shocked that, because that's a place that lots of tourists went,
yeah.
there was a place where there were two bears confined in a completely barren enclosure,
Mm,
just sitting on wooden platforms, obviously totally bored, and people were throwing peanuts at them or trying to get
yeah.
them to do something. It was pretty miserable.
Yeah, Hedda is gonna go to the Asian Zoo Association in Taiwan later this year. So
Mhm.
it historically, I think Asia is still lacking in comparison to more Anglosphere European countries in terms of how zoos are structured. But at least in some parts, they're catching up. So I think in places like Taiwan, Hong Kong, you might get pretty good zoos now, or say Singapore,
Yeah.
perhaps. Um, but even if you think about Beijing Zoo, I think there is a lot of progress. Partly you might think, well, that's a zoo kind of demonstrates also your country. Perhaps you want to have a big zoo in your capital, and that's which good with good standards. Um, but yeah, looking at the history of zoos, certainly there's a lot of horrible stuff happening. And so it's not at all surprising that some people have a very strong stance against the very idea of zoos.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, now for um well, you're both known very well for your engagement in the animal rights movement, animal liberation. But then, how did the effective altruism movement come about? It's now very influential. You see news articles about it all the time. Um, Billions gathered to help people in developing countries. Say, there's a lot of good money going into AI. I think you've criticized that a bit as an emphasis when there should be more perhaps focus on animal issues. But how did the movement come about?
Well, no, I think this, as far as I'm concerned, I didn't really have very much to do with the actual creation of the
Mm,
movement itself. Um, I think my influence was in writing the article "Famine, Affluence, and Morality," which was one of my first philosophy publications. Well, not quite my first, but it was published in Philosophy and Public Affairs in 1972. So actually, a little bit ahead of the New York Review article on animal liberation. Um, and I argued for an obligation for affluent people anyway, people
mm,
in affluent countries who are middle class or above, who can spend money on luxuries that they don't need. Um, I argued that they ought to be doing something to help people in extreme poverty, people who uh, are in danger of starving or in some other way cannot meet their basic needs, and where those needs can be very cheaply met in
mm,
comparison to standards of living in affluent countries. And and that article gradually became more and more widely read. Partly, I think, because of the rise of practical ethics and the rise of courses in practical ethics. And those courses, typically the instructor would adopt a collection of articles as a textbook. There were many of those books around, and Famine, Affluence and Morality was reprinted in most of them, I would say. So a lot of philosophy students for quite a number of years were brought up to read Famine, Affluence and Morality, mostly in the spirit of critiquing it, mostly saying, well, this article seems plausible, it starts from premises that are difficult to reject and hard to find any flaws in the argument, but it ends up with this very demanding ethic. But surely it can't be that if we don't give to charities, we're not living ethically, that we're doing something wrong, even violating our ethical obligations. So mostly students were encouraged to try to find reasons why the conclusion didn't follow from the premises. But some of those students, of course, seem to say, well, no, maybe the conclusion does follow, and the problem is that we're not doing this, rather than with the argument. And a couple of those students actually did take it that way and started to say, well, we should do something about this. And I'm thinking particularly here of some students in Oxford in the early 2000s. Toby Ord was the first one who got in contact with me. Toby Ord was then a PhD student at Oxford, and Will McCaskill was another who I met just a little bit later. And I think they had both read Famine, Affluence and Morality. And I'm talking 30 years after the article had been written. So, but they had read it and they'd thought about it, and they thought that the argument is basically sound. And so we ought to do something about it. And Toby in particular, I remember, had tried to work out how much good he could do as an individual by donating to an effective charity. And so what he did, he was a graduate student, as I said, he was on a scholarship, and he thought he was living adequately on the scholarship, but he said, so let's say, I can't remember what the figure was, but let's say at the time the scholarship was £14,000 a year. And he said, all right, let's say I need £18,000 a year. How much would that allow me to give if I succeed in having an academic career? So he looked at the salary scales, how quickly people tend to progress up those salary scales, and calculated that by the time he reached the retirement age, he would have a large sum of money. I don't remember exactly how much it was, but quite a substantial sum of money, as you would expect, if he lived on this £18,000 and saved the rest or donated the rest to effective charities. And then he said, okay, so what could I get with that money? What good could it do? And he looked around for the charity that could do the most good at low cost. And what he hit upon was funding clinics to treat trachoma. Trachoma is the largest cause of preventable blindness in the world. And it's fairly easily treatable if you get it at an early age. It's caused by a microorganism that gets in people's eyes, particularly in hot and dusty countries where there is not great hygiene. So think about North Africa, for example. And he calculated that with the money that he could save, he could prevent 80,000 people from becoming blind. And he thought, that's an amazing thing that one person, not a billionaire, not Bill Gates, just an academic, just a British academic going through the system, ending up a professor at some point, but even professors don't earn vast amounts of money. But you could prevent 80,000 people from going blind. That's incredible. And he decided to do something like that, to pledge to give, and started Giving What We Can, which I think is of as the first effective altruism organization, to tell people about how much good they could do. And, with the hope that people would be happy to know that they can do so much good, and that many of them would take the pledge, say, to give. I think the Giving What We Can pledge is to give 10% of your income until you retire. And quite a lot of people have done that. So it's been effective. And then Will McCaskill started or helped to start 80,000 Hours, which is about career choice for people going thinking about careers where they can do a lot of good, and a variety of other effective altruism organizations have spun off those.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I was invited to give a talk to an EA student group at Oxford to talk about animals. And certainly one issue we have there, similar to effective charities, you might think about where it would be most effective to put money. Say, should we try to fund anti-fishery, say, activities where we highlight how many fishes there are and how really aquaculture farming is really terrible with terrible conditions, versus say putting money against pig farming. And a calculation has to be made there. So certainly before you mentioned, well, there's many more fish that are killed, but perhaps the life of a fish might not involve as much qualitative experience as perhaps a pig. So perhaps that's would suggest maybe we should put more emphasis on the pigs, although the numbers might outweigh that. But when it comes to perhaps the most controversial case, insects, where certainly now more and more people think insects are plausible candidate for animals that might feel pain or at least have negative and positive experiences, even if they're different than ours, then obviously insect farming has such much more vast, insanely vast numbers in comparison, where you would have to kill so many more individuals to get, say, the same amount of protein as from a single cow. How would you calculate the interests of these animals against each other? Because certainly in your original writings about animal interests, it seems like we're taking a very egalitarian stance. But that doesn't seem to work if we compare the interests of a cricket versus a cow. We have to do some kind of evaluation where how much the interests of a cricket weigh against the interests of a cow here.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been an egalitarian in the sense that is opposed
Yeah.
to recognizing differences in levels of sentience or awareness of pain. It's true that the first chapter of Animal Liberation is called All Animals Are Equal, which of course is I take from George Orwell's
Yeah.
Animal Farm as a political slogan. But when I spell it out, I do say equal consideration of interests, and I recognize that animals may have different interests. And so really, I then make the principle a bit more precise by
Yeah.
saying equal consideration of similar interests. So if the interests of a cricket and a cow are not similar because the cow has a much larger brain and feels pain, let's assume the cricket does feel pain, which I don't think we can know at this stage, but assume it does. But it must be a very different kind of experience with that very different brain from that of a cow. And I would assume that the cow's experience is sharper, more acute, perhaps just, you should say, more painful. We don't know that, but that seems a reasonable assumption. And so then there are reasons for giving priority to the vertebrate animals anyway, and maybe even within vertebrates to some rather than others, rather than to invertebrates. And of course, with invertebrates, there is just that huge uncertainty as to whether they even can feel pain, are conscious at all. But there are people trying to work on this now, as you may be aware. There's what I would regard as an effective altruism research organization called Rethink Priorities, I think it is. And they have done a project on interspecies comparison, directed by Bob Fisher. And I think that's interesting. I think, obviously, the way in which they've reached their levels of sentience, which they do express, is they are the first to admit is is not. There's no certainty in this area. They're taking educated guesses, but maybe more research will eventually be done, and we will get a better handle on this. But I think that is certainly a useful thing to try to do to say. Which animals should we prioritize? I certainly will say factory farmed animals, But you suggested, well, there are a lot more fish than cows, say. So is that a reason for prioritizing fish? Well, yes, maybe. I have donated to the Fish Welfare Initiative. It's an organization that tries to do things about fish. So it's possible, but it's hard to know.
No, I agree. I'm currently funded myself by Open Philanthropy to work on a project on making welfare comparisons by looking at the evolutionary life histories of these animals and thinking about how complex are the decision problems they have to face. And if you think about this old Benthamite idea of utilitarianism, not just as a view of ethics, but also as a view of psychology and decision making, where individuals try to maximize their hedonic utility, then certainly there we might think, look, animals that don't have as complex decision problems to solve, they probably don't have as much of a range of hedonic experience. And I try to quantify that, but of course, that's still very difficult and to some extent speculative work, but it's better than just making wild guesses, because at some point we have to make decisions about where funding goes, right?
Absolutely, this is a very practical problem, and
Yeah.
I'm glad that Open Philanthropy is funding your work, and congratulations on getting that funding. I think Open Philanthropy may have funded the Rethink Priorities work that
Yeah,
was
I think
mentioned as
so.
well. Yeah, so they have an interest in that, and yeah, good for them. I think it's wonderful that that funding is coming, coming from you I'm sure know, but viewers may not, a foundation set up by Dustin Moskovitz and Carrie Tuna, who are people who, well, Dustin Moskovitz made billions from Facebook, I think, initially, and then Asana. Yeah, it's great. I think they are examples of the good examples of billionaires who are giving away their money and giving it away very thoughtfully with a lot of good research into where it can be effective.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So perhaps one more question here.
Sure.
Now that you're retired, where do you see perhaps the next 5, 10 years going? Where you're gonna put your priorities in terms of time investments?
Yeah. Well, I will still be putting my priorities into the treatment of animals, which we've been talking about, trying to reduce the suffering of animals, trying to assist people in global extreme poverty. One thing we haven't mentioned is that I founded the organization The Life You Can Save, which has a curated list of highly effective organizations helping people in extreme poverty. And you can go there and through the website, you can donate, and 100% of your donation will go to the charity you select. There's no fee taken by The Life You Can Save. Also, incidentally, if you want to read, I mentioned my article, Famine, Affluence and Morality. Eventually, I wrote a book on the same topic called The Life You Can Save. And the second 2019 edition of that, you can download absolutely free as a digital ebook or as an audio book from thelifeyoucansave.org. So I'm chair of the board of that organization. I'm not hands-on, and some of my time will certainly be used in advancing that issue. But I'm also continuing to be interested in a whole range of different kinds of ethical issues in bioethics, life and death decisions. I should also mention I'm concerned about the narrowing of freedom of expression and freedom of thought and discussion that has occurred in the last, say, 10 or 15 years, and the fact that it's very difficult to get some views published now that are not considered politically correct. So together with Jeff McMahon and Francesca Minerva, we have founded the Journal of Controversial Ideas, which enables authors to publish, if they wish, under a pseudonym, and will publish controversial ideas. It's a peer-reviewed journal, so we send things to peers who review them, but if they think that it's well argued and suitably, controversial idea that might not have been published elsewhere, then we will publish it. And that also is funded through donations, and so it's also free. You just go to journalofcontroversialideas.org, and you can read the first the issues that we have. We've been going a couple of years, So that's another thing, and obviously that takes some time to edit or co-edit a journal. So I think I have plenty to keep me busy for as long as I'm capable of doing these things.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'll put the links in the show notes so people can actually visit them without having to listen closely to how it's spelled. So thanks for coming on.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, good. Appreciate that. By the way, I'll just mention I have a Substack as well that I've just started called Bold
I'll put the
Reasoning with
link
Peter
as
Singer.
well.
Put
Yeah.
the link in there too, if you could.
I saw some
Great.
of your first articles that you've put on there.
Oh,
It's
great.
great.
Very good.
So yeah, I hope that our listeners enjoyed this episode. If you enjoyed, yeah, follow up on those links to look at Peter's work. And yeah, if you're interested, subscribe to this channel. And otherwise, have a good week. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Walter.